Hi everybody, welcome to another Left Book Club event. My name is Jo Littler. Tonight we'll be discussing Linsey McGoey's book, The Unknowers, How Strategic Ignorance Rules the World, with some incredible guests, and we're really happy to have you all join us. The Left Book Club is a subscription book club and not-for-profit initiative that seeks to foster a spirit of collective learning and political education. We aim to create spaces and avenues where people can learn from each other and discuss radical ideas that inform actions and practical steps with the goals of supporting struggles that are fighting for us all. Left Book Club events have featured some great speakers over the months. Feel free to check out the video library on YouTube for discussions engaging with a wide range of radical thought. Tonight, don't forget to ask your questions on the YouTube live stream chat. If you'd like to become a member of the Left Book Club, please visit leftbookclub.com and click Become a Member, or you can start by subscribing to the mailing list. The links are in the description of the YouTube live stream. You can also follow the Left Book Club on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook to keep up to date with events, promotions and giveaways. And please do subscribe to the YouTube channel while you're watching us tonight. Okay, so this evening, I'm really pleased that we're discussing The Unknowers, How Strategic Ignorance Rules the World by Linsey McGoey. Originally published in 2019 by Z, it's just been reissued by the Left Book Club. It's a really engaging and very lucid book, which opens up discussion about the meaning and uses of ignorance in really productive ways. It makes a claim for the importance of recognizing the existence of all our ignorance, for example, of the importance of humility, as well as focusing on the strategic abuses of those who pretend not to know in order to get away with furthering the interests of the few at the expense of the many, from colonial power and economic rent-seeking in the 18th and 19th centuries to the behaviour of media corporations, governments and big pharma today. And really, could there be a more timely topic the day after Dominic Cummings, that elite pusher of strategic ignorance, selectively exposes Matt Hancock and Boris Johnson's strategic use of ignorance over COVID? So we've got an amazing lineup today to discuss the book and to talk about the topic. Firstly, we have the author herself, Linsey McGoey. Linsey is Professor in Sociology at the University of Essex. She's written for The Guardian, The Times, The Spectator, Jacobin and Fortune. And as always, she's also the author of No Such Thing as a Free Gift on the Gates Foundation and the Costs of Philanthropy. She's also co-editor of the Routledge Handbook of Ignorance Studies. Then we have Emily Kenway. Emily is a writer, activist and former policy advisor who spent 10 years working on social justice issues as an advisor to the UK's first independent anti-slavery commissioner. Her writing's been published by The Guardian, The Independent, HuffPost, Times Literary Supplement, etc. Her first book, The Truth About Modern Slavery, came out this year with Pluto, and Emily is currently working on her second book called Who Cares on Care Work. And finally, we have musician, writer and political campaigner Lowkey. He has spoken and performed on platforms from the Oxford Union to the Royal Albert Hall and Glastonbury. His latest album, Soundtrack to the Struggle 2, featured Noam Chomsky and Frankie Boyle and has been streamed millions of times. He is a patron of Stop the War Coalition, Palestinian Solidarity Campaign, the Racial Justice Network and the Peace and Justice Project founded by Jeremy Corbyn. So we've got about 90 minutes in total. Our speakers will all talk for around 10 minutes each. Then I'll ask them a few questions and then we'll throw it open to the floor for question and answers. So do put your questions in the live stream. Okay, so to begin with, we'll go to you, Linsey, to outline the book. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. So I'd like to start by really offering my very deep thanks to the panelists and to the organizers for being here tonight. It's really, for me, in many ways, really a dream group of thinkers to be in conversation with. And I'm very honored by the time you've all taken. And I'm reading now for some notes on the screen I just mentioned. So if anyone needs my attention, just do speak up in order to intervene. So thanks as well to everyone who is attending tonight. I'm not expecting anyone to have necessarily had time to read any or all of the book. And I also think that tonight, one of the goals of the panel is to see how the politics of ignorance intersects with different areas of life, not necessarily covered in the book. So for example, Emily may or may not touch on the criminalization of sex workers, which is a theme that I don't myself cover, but we're going to really be expanding the discussion to areas that are very important today politically that were not covered, for example, by the fact that my book came out in 2019 and a lot has happened since. But so that we are starting off with something of a shared vocabulary for the discussion, I thought that I would define some of the concepts that I introduce and that I use in the book, and in particular, the term strategic ignorance. And then I'll spend a little bit of time talking about the concepts of micro-ignorance versus macro-ignorance. And so I've been writing about strategic ignorance for really nearly 15 years now, and I define it as the exploitation of the unknowns in an environment in order to assert authority, to evade liability for past actions, or to command more resources in future. And for a couple of reasons that I'll turn to now, I want to stress that this is it's a sociological definition, highlighting the institutional power to compound and to foment perceptions of what is known or unknown about different aspects of life. But I'm not the only person using the term strategic ignorance, and I think it's useful to point out how my definition is different from how psychologists use the term. And in psychology, there's also been recently, especially over the past decade or two, a lot of growing interest in the notion of strategic ignorance. And psychologists tend to define it as an individual cognitive phenomenon, as a type of cognitive bias, where people turn away from and strategically ignore a piece of information that may be true, but which challenges or undermines a prior ideological viewpoint. And we can all do this, and it can often be at times a cross-partisan phenomenon, which we can come back to if there's time, if people feel like in the discussion period. And there's a lot of interesting lab-based studies which show how pervasive this tendency is to want to turn away from inconvenient information. And these studies are interesting, in part, really, for the most part, because they really challenge really quite naive assumptions in economic theory about so-called rational, information-seeking, utility-maximizing consumers. And such assumptions can be a tool of diversion, thwarting attention away from how the market actually functions in practice, enabling mainstream economics to sideline the study of how state power and market power fortify different forms of neocolonialism and worker exploitation. So a richer psychological understanding of how humans actually behave and interact when it comes to the market and when it comes to information attainment or information avoidance, it's a valuable thing, and it's why these psychological definitions are useful. But at the same time, the problem with them is that they don't pay enough attention to the fact that some people have more power to ignore with impunity, while other people, typically the poor, people with maligned or discredited or simply denigrated accents, or people without white privilege, are often more punished and discredited for their perceived ignorance. So one of my key points in the book is that typically we tend to perceive societal hierarchies of ignorance in the wrong way. Ignorance is seen as a bottom-heavy problem, with so-called lay individuals or non-experts upheld to be the most ignorant and more ignorant than those with specialized knowledge about things. And I'm not going to offer a complete apologetics. I don't want to offer sort of an absolution or an apologetics for this uneducated group, because there can be racism there, xenophobia, for example, among the lay group, that more education can help. But to presume that the uneducated are more ignorant or more unknowing than elites is, I argue, simply untrue. It ignores the fact that much ignorance in society is made and reinforced by powerful groups who don't want to have to face, or to be forced to face, or to shoulder the ramifications for how their own power and wealth harms other people's. So instead, they become masters of the unknown. And so to drive this point home in the book, I introduce a distinction between micro-ignorance and macro-ignorance. And so micro-ignorance, and these are, this is the last sociological jargon I'll throw at you, but I think the concepts are useful for a couple of reasons, which is really to highlight the distributional ways that hierarchy benefits that ignorance benefits some groups more so than others. So micro-ignorance, I define as the individual act of turning away from information or facts that you simply don't like. Whereas macro-ignorance, on the other hand, is the sedimentation of individual acts of ignoring into larger structural unknowns. And my key point that I make is that the capacity to create macro-ignorance is not equally distributed across society. Those who have more power also have the capacity to be more elite at ignorance, to be more advantaged unknowers, in that they have more resources to use the law and the media to shape beliefs about what is true or not. And a typical way that this power can be seen is through the teaching, for example, of empire and colonialism, or the lack thereof in classrooms. And on this point, I'm building on the work of scholars like Audre Lorde, who coined the term historical amnesia, as well as Charles Mills's concept of white ignorance, where he argues that mainstream political theories are built upon a certain central deceit or obfuscation at their heart, which is the fact that principles of universalism espoused by, for example, mainstream social contract theories have never been true in practice, and they hide through their very claim to universality different forms of white oppression and state violence. So what I think that my focus on micro-ignorance versus macro-ignorance adds to this body of work is a new vocabulary and a new theoretical framework for understanding both the durability and the fragility of different forms of structural ignorance identified by earlier generations of scholars. And so to try to come to a conclusion for this really brief introduction of some concepts that I'm using just to sort of set the stage for the discussion that we're going to be having, and to look at some of the ways that this power to ignore advantages different groups in practice, I want to come back to this point about who are the unknowers. And I see them as all of us. We all have the capacity to deny inconvenient information, as well, on the other hand, as to seek to unknow received wisdom in ways that can be fruitful and even emancipative. But that power is not evenly distributed throughout society. In the workplace, in schools, in corporations, elite individuals and elite groups have the power to be institutionally better at ignorance, not because they're cognitively advantaged in some way, but because they are structurally advantaged to use different resources in order to thwart inconvenient information from emerging in the first place, which could undermine their societal position. Even though we tend to see the hierarchy of ignorance in the opposite order, as the scourge of the uneducated, rather than a weapon of the powerful. And I think that therefore upending this wrongful but very widely held presumption about whose ignorance is most damaging and does the most political and social damage and reinforces the most societal inequality, upending the hierarchy of ignorance, which trends to posit that ignorance is more pervasive at the bottom of social hierarchies. That's ultimately one of the main goals of the book. And so I'll end there for now, and thank you again for having me on. And I'm really looking forward to the chance to engage with the other panelists.
That's great. Thanks very much, Linsey. Just a reminder to everyone to write your questions in the live stream, and we'll come back to them later on. And now I'm going to hand over to you, Emily.
Great, thank you so much. And it's such a pleasure to hear Linsey speaking about her book, which has been extremely powerful for me in my work. So yeah, I'm going to talk about how it relates to the work that I've done and the book that came out in January I wrote. Before I get going, just in case people don't know what I'm talking about, modern slavery, as a superficial meaning of a phrase, is an umbrella term for a range of exploitative circumstances. So it includes trafficking, forced labor, domestic servitude, stuff like that. So when I say trafficking, it's part of the modern slavery house of terms. But more importantly, modern slavery is certainly not just a phrase. It's not just a crime type that got made under the 2015 Modern Slavery Act. It's also a political story about exploitation. It's a particular way of describing exploitation that's become popularized in recent years. And in a nutshell, before I get to how it overlaps with Linsey's work, it's a story that relies on a particular narrative about historical slavery. So it's asking us to conjure up connotations of historical slavery when we think about exploitation today. And that narrative is a white-centric, kind of grand abolitionist crusading one where we, the UK, abolished slavery and William Wilberforce was the hero. And you certainly see that in modern slavery speeches and policy making. And it has specific characteristics that shape how we think about and understand exploitation today. So it tends to make us think about exploitation, severe forms of it, as kind of accidental aberrations, right? In terms of historical slavery, this is the idea that it's kind of like history that caused slavery. That's where it's this amorphous accident of history that only recently have names being put to that. Have we seen some kinds of culpability coming into play? In terms of modern slavery, it's portrayed as being caused by individual deviants. Your foreign gang is what you will typically see in the media or police talking about. And in that way, because it's caused by kind of an individual aberration, it's separated out from anything to do with the system, with the economy, with immigration policy, whatever it might be. And it's not seen as political, right? It's like a humanitarian issue, something that we all want to tackle. Nobody thinks slavery should have happened. Surely nobody thinks modern slavery should be happening. And in this way, it depoliticizes exploitation. In my book, I show how that operates across key themes like immigration policy, sex work, big brands, public attitudes. But when we look at the types of people who are leading this new abolitionist era, this kind of crusade against the scourge of modern slavery, we can see something isn't right. And this is what leads us down the path of ignorance examination. So Theresa May, as Home Secretary and Prime Minister, Boris is continuing it. Trump had a lot to say about the crusade against trafficking in relation to Mexico into the US. Priti Patel on Calais to the UK, and major brands like Unilever or the Consumer Goods Forum, which is a worldwide trade body of like over 400 retailers. So these are not your average lineup for people that care about injustice. It's not who we would bump into on a demo. So what is going on here? Well, this is where we start to look under the bonnet of this modern slavery story about exploitation and find out why those people, and specifically, more importantly, the power dynamics and imbalances that they represent are so keen on this modern slavery story. And that's where Linsey's work is such a powerful framework for analysis, and that was really important for me in writing the book. So I'm just going to give you a handful of examples of how her concepts are so helpful for shining a light on this. So I've already given a brief outline of one area of strategic ignorance, which is about history. So essentially, this kind of crusading narrative relies on ahistorical, profoundly problematic ideas about the slave trade. Firstly, that we abolished it. What we abolished was the legal right to own another person. In fact, that led directly to circumstances that were as exploitative as the slave trade. So the mass shipping and movement and forced labor of millions of Indian and Chinese people onto plantations, for example. And of course, the little problem of who caused slavery in the first place is left out of these narratives. And we see this playing out now in political documents. So the Conservative Party 2019 election manifesto had this amazing line in it: from helping to end the slave trade to tackling modern slavery, the UK has long been a beacon of freedom and human rights. And it's this like revisionist approach to things. We also see what Linsey calls strategies of non-disclosure, which I think is such a fantastically useful phrase. So rescue is a key part of the modern slavery story. Like, modern slavery as a concept is basically a fairy tale about exploitation. You've got your bad other who causes it. You've got your innocent victim who's duped or lured into it and apparently has no agency and like no choice about anything. And then you go and rescue them and everything's fine. That's what we're told. Spot the signs of a slave and everything will be fine because they'll be rescued. Well, in fact, rescue is not at all what happens today with people who experience exploitation in the UK, including those who are by government identified as victims. So, for example, we see this with raids on brothels that are described by police or media as tackling trafficking, as rescuing people. When you actually dig in through freedom of information requests to the number of people referred for support as victims of trafficking, the ones I did for my book found none. That's not to say it doesn't happen, but what we're being told is not an accurate picture, and it is serving a purpose. Very obviously, between January 2013 and June 2019, Parliament was asked 6 times for data on how many victims of trafficking were being held in immigration detention. And each time we're told on the record that this information wasn't held centrally or wasn't recorded. Very luckily, a volunteer-led project got their hands on that data in 2019, possibly just because the officer on the Freedom of Information request was a different person that day. We don't know why. Over 500 people in immigration detention who were victims of trafficking, it was found out. So that is a deliberate strategy of non-disclosure that has now been exposed. I think finally, the kind of most important thing for me is something that Linsey was talking about actually, which it underlines the whole topic of exploitation and the way that we're treating it with this modern slavery story. This idea of who is allowed to have knowledge and who is inferior, who is deemed inferior in terms of their knowledge, is very powerful. When we look at the modern slavery space, the classic division of knowledge we see is between the intelligent, knowing politicians, CEOs, charity workers, whoever, versus the ignorant, poor, racialized people who those others are like really trying to help, you know, that's the classic kind of story we get. And that's why one of the dominant tactics of this space is awareness raising. So these are campaigns that try to educate people who are at risk of being exploited, who are deemed vulnerable, to educate them about those risks, to let them know that trafficking happens, that they might be exploited. So in Nigeria, for example, the UK government has funded a project called Stamp Out Slavery in Nigeria, which tried to educate people in Nigeria, young people, about the risks of migrating, and was a behaviour change programme to try to discourage aspirational migration. Now, that's very obviously immigration policy in the guise of anti-trafficking, which is extraordinarily and depressingly common. But the evaluation of that project says, weirdly enough, the reason that people migrate unsafely is because of poverty, lack of alternative opportunities. It's not because they don't know that it's not safe, because weirdly, they're not stupid. This amazing PhD student, Peter Olayiwola, did a similar piece of work, again in Nigeria actually, where there's an issue with children migrating from villages to cities to work as domestic workers in what can be quite exploitative conditions. And the Nigerian government's solution to this was awareness raising. Go and tell the parents and kids in the villages that their kids might be exploited, and then they'll stop sending them. No one had actually bothered to ask them if they knew this or why they were sending their kids, but Peter went and asked them. Lo and behold, they can even define trafficking, which, you know, most people can't in the UK today. They were fully aware of the risks. And it was, again, a question of economic opportunities, a question of like serious destitution in some cases, and in other cases, a social mobility strategy. But basically, they were intelligent people, just like everyone else, making rational decisions about what was best for their family in the future. And although those are Nigerian examples, we see examples of that in the UK all the time as well, with, for example, workers in hand car washes who don't want to be saved by the police because it's their best economic option. All of that is basically demonstrating something Linsey was saying, which is you can only think that that is a logical way to think about what's going on, that you need to raise people's awareness if you're building on a foundation of ignorance, whether genuine ignorance on the part of policymakers or a purposefully designed space of ignorance, a failure to understand the reality of the economy for people around the world today. And that is, for me, why The Unknowers, which I read while I was writing the book, was so powerful for kind of looking under the bonnet of this storyline that we're being sold and really interrogating what it means and what we should be doing differently.
That's great. Thank you, Emily. And now over to you, Lowkey.
Hi, thank you very much for having me today. It was a great read. Thank you, Linsey. I previously have read the Agnotology book edited by Robert Proctor and Londa Scheibinger. And what it showed to me was this, particularly Proctor in his opening chapter, points to a distinction between ignorance as a selective choice and ignorance as an active construct. Now, what I think is really important to look at is the mechanisms through which that ignorance can become the active construct. And Michael J. Smithson, in his chapter, looks at 5 different functions that can be served by negotiated ignorance arrangements. Now, the particular one that I want to look at is legitimation, the use of ignorance to justify actions and choices. We live in an age of coercion, whereby engineering ignorance through the disguising of agency in order to forge in both senses of the word what Gramsci called an active consensus to public policy. It could be financial conscription during the War on Terror years, but also, interestingly, how that intertwined and married anti-migrant ideas in society, and how those were quite successfully astroturfed through organizations which, through their ubiquity in our society, achieve a level of invisibility, when actually, when you look a little bit deeper at who funds those organizations, you may be able to identify some type of agency at work. You know, we know that the war on terror itself was a war on choice. The Taliban offered Osama bin Laden to the United States, and the Bush government refused and went ahead with the war. This war, which has lasted longer than World War I and World War II put together, has entailed on average 46 US bombs being dropped per day, and has displaced around 37 million people. Now, Peter Gallison, in his chapter in the book Agnotology, puts it in the following way: the classified universe is certainly not smaller and is probably much larger than the unclassified one. And in 2001, the year that the war on terror started, the US government took 33 million different classified actions and spent $5.5 billion just in that year to keep those classified documents secure. Those were what Donald Rumsfeld, of course, would have been referring to when he called them the unknown unknowns, or, you know, these things that Chomsky, when he spoke about, are the things that people not only don't know, but they don't know that they don't know. And in Britain, we had a policy also, aside from just classifying things, there was something called Operation Legacy, which entailed the cooperation of hundreds, if not thousands, of colonial officials in the British government. Special branch were involved, MI5 liaison officers, and all 3 branches of the armed forces were also involved in Operation Legacy. It was the deliberate or obscuring of Britain's history. 37 different colonies had documents that the British government had collected, destroyed before decolonization. They were either sunk to the bottom of the sea, or they were burnt, or they were hidden in Britain at Hanslope Park. So secrecy and the construction of ignorance and monopolization of knowledge is not something new to the political establishment in Britain or the establishment in the United States. It is as old as water itself. When we think about the way that the war on terror has been used, and a lot of the astroturfing that took place in order to use this threat inflation to launch these wars, it quite easily was able to morph into anti-immigration feeling. You look at the case of Shamima Begum, for example. When she first entered Syria, it was reported by Associated Press and Reuters and others that her trip with 2 other children, remember she was 15 years old at the time, was in fact facilitated by an intelligence agent from the US-led coalition. Now, what the Shamima Begum story, rather than being a story about accountability of intelligence agencies, possibly partaking in child trafficking into war zones, it turned into a public, basic lynching of this this young woman who had lost several children in really tragic circumstances. And as Linsey points to in her book, behind all of these processes, there is what she calls a deliberate anti-visibility and a strategic effort to make one's ideas seem to have originated elsewhere to avoid the appearance of primary involvement. Well, when we think about organizations such as Migrant Watch UK, opaquely funded, Policy Exchange, another think tank which constantly pushes a very insular conception of the world, an aversion to real accountability of the powerful, both of them are deemed to be some of the most opaquely funded think tanks in the country. You look at an organization like Henry Jackson Society, constantly pushing the idea that British life as we know it is under threat from some enemy somewhere. It could be the Russians, it could be the Chinese, it's always the Muslims. Look at an organization like Center for Policy Studies in the United States, who gave Donald Trump the foundation for the Muslim ban. They're funded not only by Lockheed Martin, the arms company, but Raytheon and other arms companies also. I view these kind of organizations as essentially well-paid, well-fed agnotologists. When we think about what has happened and how this threat inflation was able to morph into anti-migrant feeling, first we have to understand that according to Major Chris Hunter, specialist in terrorism for the British government, your chances in this country of being caught in an act of political violence are 1 in 16 million. According to Baroness Warsi of the Conservative Party, less than 0.1% of Muslims in this country have been involved in political violence. According to Dr. Frank Harvey, you are 4 times more likely to be struck by lightning. And yet you have policies like Prevent that, according to Professor David Miller, require public sector employees to violate the 2010 Equality Act, which stipulates that one should not discriminate against somebody on the basis of their religion. And a way of understanding the way in which Prevent ostensibly may not be about Muslims, in practice it is, as we see from Damien Breen's book, Muslim Schools, Communities and Critical Race Theory, that between 2008 and 2011, the allocating of Prevent funding to boroughs was proportionate to the Muslim populations within them. Interestingly, though, during the same period, only 0.7% of terrorist attacks in all EU countries were carried out by Muslims. So how can we explain polling which finds 1 in 5 young people between 18 and 30 in this country believing there is an unresolvable conflict between Islam and the West? How can we explain that 14% of these young people were found to have this idea that there actually were no-go Sharia law areas? How can we understand that despite the fact that Britain is 86%, if you'd use crude terms, white, how can we explain that more than 1 in 10 of the young people asked believed that white people were in fact a minority in Britain? 1 in 5 young people believing that British culture is under threat from invasion, despite the fact that only 0.18% of the population in this country are in fact refugees. And even when you look at it across the EU, in 2020, you had around 500,000 asylum applications. Well, in a political unit, an economic unit that actually has a population of about 450 million people, that means that 1/5 of 1% of the population of the entire EU are actually applying for asylum. So how can we explain this idea becoming so prevalent, and who is to blame? Well, clearly these organizations, who are often given free rein and whose reports are often reproduced uncritically in major newspapers as headlines, certainly would share some of the blame for simply a counterfactual perception of reality. You look at an organization now defunct, Quilliam, it wrote about 264 offenders across 58 cases and used that study. This was over 12 years that those 264 offenders were identified. They used that study to then feed to the newspapers the idea that 84% of grooming gang cases were Pakistani men. Well, if you actually look at the figures, you have between the year of 2016, 2017 in England and Wales, over 646,000 people being recorded as victims of sexual assault. As we know that the majority of, and that's an amazingly high figure as for somebody like me, perhaps that's my own ignorance speaking, but think about this. You have allowed an organization to use 264 offenders over 12 years as the basis for their research, out of what surely would be several million cases, several million people, several million different cases. However, the mantra and the refrain was created by that headline, and you paved the way for the leader of UKIP to talk about a Holocaust of our daughters. And obviously then Priti Patel followed up and said, yes, we will use it to understand how better to apply our policy, especially when thinking along cultural and racial lines. It wasn't until much later that the Home Office came out and made clear that this was completely counterfactual stuff. And in fact, it was found that Asian men were not only not overrepresented in cases of sexual offense, in fact, they were underrepresented proportionate to the percentage of the population. So I think it's really important, as Linsey makes the point very well in this book, to understand the engineering and the astroturfing that goes into a lot of the ideas which are projected from the top downwards.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Lowkey, and thanks to all of you. Linsey, so I really like the way you build on the idea of denial, to focus on kind of active construction, or the weaponization of ignorance by elites, and use lots of really great terms like ignorance alibis and ignorance pathways between personal ignorance and larger social systems. So I wondered if you could give us some examples of this in practice. So in the book, for example, you talk about economics, but any examples you want to give? And also perhaps could you say a little bit about what pathways out of ignorance there might be? So what kind of resources of hope might we have?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. That's a great question. And thank you so much to the panelists for your just incredibly provocative and brilliant remarks. There's just been so much to work with. And I think I'm going to have a very rich discussion. And I think I want to link Joe's question in particular to a few of Lowkey's points about linking this back to some of the literature from Prochnow and others on the sort of more agnotology field of looking at ignorance, because I think That was a sort of really foundational volume that Lowkey pointed out by Londa Scheibinger and Robert Proctor on agnotology, and it featured work from people like Peter Gallison, who's at Harvard, looking at the problem of classified information, which particularly, it was published in 2007, so it was published right after we knew that there was a lot of manipulation of facts surrounding the pretext for going to war and invading Iraq, and we knew that officials were essentially manipulating knowledge in plain sight. And this was sanctioned at some of the highest levels with sort of major political professors like John Mearsheimer later published an excellent book that just detailed at length some of the lies that were blatantly stated by people like Rumsfeld in the lead up to the war. And yet we've conveniently forgotten that now. It's sort of strategically ignored now that in the pre-2016 period, there was a lot of so-called post-truth manipulation going on as well. And I think it's really important to highlight that the 2003 invasion was a time when there was blatant deceit on public display. But it also, I think, points to what I see as some of the limits of the analysis of someone like Gallison. Not really the limit so much as a framing that sees knowledge and ignorance as sort of diametrically opposed rather than interrelated. And what I mean by opposed is that his emphasis, particularly in that chapter, so it's a great chapter Lowkey's mentioned, it's called Removing Knowledge, and it's in this book called On Agnotology by Proctor and Scheibinger. But he points out that the world of classified information is so large, and I think in a way that absolves the unclassified world of being a space where the production of ignorance often happens in plain sight, not through removing documents or classifying information, but through untruths being stated openly in ways that confers an ignorance alibi on other groups. And I'll give you one example that I was using in a presentation I was giving this morning that didn't come into the book, but that I really think came up recently when we're looking at this suppression of curriculum teaching of critical race theory, or the real pushback that we've seen from UK elites against the push to have more knowledge of colonialism being centered in schools. And there was this incredible quote that came out in October 2020 by Kemi Badenoch, okay, the Equalities and Women's Minister for the Conservatives. And Badenoch sort of gave a speech in the Commons that was later reproduced as an op-ed, where she said, it is quite right that the education that children receive in schools should be centered on the history of these islands, okay? So she sort of defended the idea that we should have an insular approach to teaching that centered what she saw as British history proper, in essence, which was restricted to the islands. But that in itself is a misinformed sort of statement, which suggests that the history of the islands was not shaped by, centuries-long processes of extraction and exploitation and wealth drain, as Utsa Paetnik puts it, to use that really excellent phrase by her, that really excellent Indian economist Paetnik, who talks about the drain of wealth from India. So Badenoch making that statement in the Commons, challenged by the left certainly, and challenged sort of off the record, but that point about the teaching should be restricted to the islands perpetuates an untruth openly, not in a classified way. It's not a type of secrecy or even denial. It's an open embrace of a restricted, isolated way of seeing British history, which then confers a sort of spurious but quite durable ignorance alibi on people who sort of troll activists in public and say, where are your parents from? Where are your grandparents from? Where's their homeland? Well, they were subjects of British Empire. They were intimately bound up, not to me because of my white privilege, for example, but who troll anyone of color on Twitter and say, I'm personally not British, but I probably get told less to go home to Canada than someone gets told to go home to, say, India or Bangladesh because they happen to be of color. And, I'm not absolving those trolls, but those trolls gain support from elite at the highest levels in the Houses of Commons, the House of Commons, which is really problematic because you have this sort of top-down reinforcement of ignorance in ways that sort of, as I put it in the book, to grow, ignorance needs to have rain. Ignorance can't grow without being rained upon from the top at the highest levels.
Yeah, and I think that also relates to how in the book you make it clear that it also depends on this idea that, you know, something like slavery and racial capitalism was always conflict free. You know, that the idea that that disapproving of it is a new thing is a very kind of Tory trope as well, isn't it? That's a kind of another ignorance strategy. Okay, Emily, over to you. So how do you think these concepts relate to the behaviour of big brands, which you've talked about a bit?
Thanks, Jo. Well, there's a really useful concept, another one in Linsey's book, the phrase useful unknowns, which she says describe gaps in understandings that provide clear benefits for particular individuals or groups. And they might not have knowingly manufactured these useful unknowns, but they are benefiting from them nonetheless. And for me, this is just absolutely like bullseye on what's going on with big brands and supply chains in relation to exploitation and this idea of modern slavery. So have in your mind the number of meetings I've had the misfortune to be in with major companies who have these endless conversations about, like, how can we find out how workers are feeling in our supply chains? Like, how can we find out about their conditions and what it's like there and find out if they're okay? And it's like this great conundrum, and there's always a kind of young white man who wants to make an app to solve it, to find out how the workers are feeling. And it's this kind of mysterious idea. So the modern slavery story about exploitation has really created that idea of this kind of mysterious space. When exploitation is understood as something exceptional, as a kind of extraneous thing that hardly ever happens and is very extreme, the tools that are selected by industry, so big companies, that are respected by the government and the public, are ones that make sense for something that's extreme and occasional. So in case of large companies, the obvious tool here is auditing. It's a extremely boring sounding word, but it's really important to understand what's actually going on. So audits are basically periodic checks on what's going on with the workforce, quite kind of clipboard, tick box, in and out type situations usually. And when you speak to companies about this, they think that because they've hired what is often like an ex-law enforcement consultant or some kind of company like that to come in and do these audits, go along their production line, not too far down into the supply chain, just stay at the top where things are probably more okay. And because those consultants, those auditors haven't spotted anyone like in rags, like very clearly a slave, which is the part of the problem with this word, because today severe exploitation doesn't necessarily have the markers that historical slavery had. They think that their job's done because they've sent in this kind of lens that seeks the extreme. But the reality of exploitation is, firstly, that it may not present in that extreme way today, but also more importantly, perhaps, that where you have general labor abuses, so like underpayment of wages, general shitty conditions of whatever form, you will also find more extreme cases that fall under the Modern Slavery Act. So for example, in Sports Direct warehouses, there's been obviously a lot of talk about the conditions that are there, and there have been cases of exploitation falling under the Modern Slavery Act. In Leicester, with the garment sector, you have the same thing. So where you have one, you will find the other. And that's because exploitation isn't exceptional, of course. It's produced by the political economy that we're in and by the immigration policy that surrounds that. It's actually very normalized and very endemic, including very severe forms. And so when you understand that, these tools like audits make absolutely no sense, right? Because they're looking for a bad apple and the problem is the rotten barrel. And then what comes into view are these useful unknowns called trade unions that the entire exploitation space has basically forgotten about. And trade unions have unfortunately had the ground completely taken away from them on the topic of exploitation by this storyline of modern slavery that says the solution is brand driven, is in audits and stuff like that. Because of course unions are there day in, day out, teaching people to protect their rights. They're kind of like ongoing camera footage of what's happening in a workplace, whereas an audit is at best a snapshot, and a snapshot taken by someone who is paid by the boss to find a good perspective. And that's really, for me, kind of a core element of ignorance in this space, is that the construction of exploitation as exceptional enables this manufactured ignorance about these long tried and tested solutions that we have right in front of us to ensuring good working conditions, but that are completely forgotten in this space. And it is really the fact that brands it doesn't occur to them. Even your most well-meaning ethical trade managers are just in this conundrum about how do we find out how workers are feeling, and it's just not on the table at all. So I think it's an absolutely bang-on framework for understanding that.
That reminds me a bit of the fetishization of ethical consumption, rather than trying to reform all production and consumption so that it's all ethical. Great, okay. And Lowkey, you talked about the weaponization of ignorance and how that relates to the war on terror. I wondered if you could say a little bit more about that and say something about some of the ways in which that ignorance is being exposed.
Well, I think what's interesting about the country that we live in is that we have a lot of conversation about sovereignty and about Britishness, when, according to some estimates, we have 105 US military bases here. We also have the census carried out in 2010 by Lockheed Martin. They had previously 6 different senior executives in the Bush administration. They are identified as #1 on the database for people that get government contracts that have had issues of corruption, that have had they've been sued for stuff around race. They also were involved in the torture of people in Abu Ghraib. They were involved in interrogation at Guantanamo Bay. But the extent to which we as a society have a readiness to even know who Lockheed Martin are is limited. And that's not because people are limited, it's because the mechanisms through which information is communicated not have a complete aversion to it, but it's very much able to fade and camouflage into the general cultural ambience of the time. But it's not the only kind of mantra that is manufactured, this one of sort of Britain as a sort of sovereign nation. We've got a monarchy that was established by the Normans in 1066. We've got 792 members of the House of Lords, 26 bishops representing the Church of England, whereas in what we know as Parliament, the House of Commons, you only have 650 members. So you've got far more people in the House of Lords who are literally just there through nothing democratic. There's been over 1,000 laws that have been vetted by the royal family through the Privy Council over the last few decades. But yet we're still in a position where we would refer to this country as a democracy. Why? Because the mantra has been so successfully drummed into us. It was 300 years that you had movements like the Levellers, the Putney debates, the Peterloo massacre, where people were killed in the street in Manchester merely for asking for parliamentary representation for people who weren't landed gentry. The Chartists, the suffragettes, the Tolpuddle martyrs, these were seen as the extremists of their time. They were imprisoned, they were tortured, they were exiled to penal colonies. And it wasn't until after World War I that you saw that start to change. But even right up until World War I, the suffragettes were seen as the most extreme of extremists. It was only really in World War I when those kind of things started to change. So we're looking at 300 years of agitation in this country for even partial political representation. Yet this mantra of Britain as a democracy, as an independent sovereign nation, is seemingly receiving great traction around the society. You know, you even look at the death of Prince Philip. Obviously, he was someone that was born in Greece. You know, the idea that you would have this yacht to symbolize this great patriotism is just such a masquerade when you think about the fact that it's, you know, being built by Camel Lard, which is owned by the Peel Group, which is the Whitaker family control it from the Isle of Man, a tax haven, and 25% of the company is owned by a Saudi company, the Alliance Group. So we have these lies about what our society is and what it represents that is hollowed out. You know, 37% of all tax losses across the world come from British network of tax havens. You know, Britain has about 150 military bases around the world. In what way can we talk about Britain as completely post-colonial? It may not occupy 14 million miles of the planet as it once did, but its relationship with the rest of the world is still one of extraction, even through corporations within the same parts of the world that they previously controlled, and the borders that were left and were drawn by the British. So in terms of understanding the way that a lot of the ignorances around the war on terror can be revealed, unfortunately, such a good job has been done at dividing and encouraging a sort of vertical solidarity and horizontal blame among many people in this country. They do not understand and view in the way that would be far better for movement building their shared interests and commonalities with the people around the world who are victims of the kind of violence that Britain, through its junior partner status with the United States, aims at much of the world, you know. And Britain is still involved in 7 different covert wars around the world, from Syria to Somalia to Libya, to Iraq, to Pakistan, to Afghanistan. Britain is involved in those military operations, but it's seen as a sort of a non-existing forever war, unfortunately.
Yes, indeed. Okay, thank you very much. So we're going to turn it over to questions from the audience. So remember that you can write more questions in, but I'll just read one out now. Okay, so in a UK society with a monarchy, House of Lords, and a decade of austerity, plus an 80+ Tory majority, the endemic nature of ignorance is hard to argue against. How might our education systems save us? Anyone want to take that? Linsey?
I think I'd spend a lot of time talking throughout the book about the ways that in many fields, even at the highest levels, and particularly actually at the highest levels and at the most elite schools, we're seeing a lot of the problem of being educated into more ignorance and more unawareness of the ways that we are implicated in some of the global strife and violence that both Lowkey and Emily were both detailing in different ways. Because I mean, the violence is even more obvious when you look at something like the war on terror, but the violence is also there through the economic violence that is perpetuated, as Emily was saying, through the fact that actually different forms of exploitation are systematic and pervasive rather than being isolated. But a language of modern slavery, as problematic as different forms of ongoing enslavement are, it's estimated about 25 million people might be, 25 to million might be enslaved in some way, which is a horrific number. But billions are actually suffering due to unfair low pay and dispossession, like billions. We've got a global population of sort of 7 or 8 billion, and the isolated wealth concentrated in a handful of people is extreme, and billions are being underpaid and exploited through some of the tax transfers, the tax laws that these talks have detailed. And how that is obscured and veiled, I suggest in the book, is through what I call the status quo. I call it the status quo populism of people like Steven Pinker and Bill Gates, who until very recently was upheld as a paragon of sort of high status knowledge about the state of the world. So when Gates would say, we're doing better than ever, when Steven Pinker, who's a sort of Harvard psychologist, but then who dabbles in a little bit of, gleaning different sociological theories here and there and not really reading them as in depth as he should, but publishes best-selling books about enlightenment now, which say that we've progressed to a state of civility that really is awesome. And we really just have to sort of bow down before the corporate overlords that kind of got us to that state. He gets away with saying this stuff without really being challenged sufficiently. And I think that is why, unfortunately, education is not the panacea we might hope it to be. If you think of education in the formal way of being everyone goes to university, gets a degree, and hopes to then graduate into a world of fair treatment, they're not going to graduate into that world increasingly. They're going to graduate into a world of increased corporate power and domination over the right to organize, a world of increased efforts to disenfranchise different groups. They're going to graduate into an unfair world. And I think, but at these venues, at universities too, there is exposure to other ideas. So finding ways to not see education as a panacea, but try to improve the cost and the accessibility and the equality of different forms of education is unfortunately an insufficient solution, but one of the best solutions we have for raising more awareness potentially. And then I think education in, more informal ways that Gramsci would discuss through his work on sort of, organic intellectualism, that's also important for finding other venues where people can come together and gather and discuss ideas. But this is where I think there's never hopelessness either, because people are finding ways to communicate through new mediums, which are so exciting in themselves too, which I think have the power to be emancipative. Like the fact that throughout history, some of the groups Lowkey just described managed to overcome in the most difficult circumstances, just prove that there could be this power of some sort of emancipatory, what I think of as almost an unknowing surrounding where the next successful uprising will really come from. And I attribute that sort of to Lord in the book, and I call it the Lord principle. Kind of a play on words. I'm sort of rambling now, but it's a play on words of what there's a liberal thinker who I think gets denigrated because he's seen as being sort of on the right, but actually Tocqueville, in many ways, Alexis de Tocqueville, was quite an important democratic theorist. And even though it served his aristocratic interests to sort of militate against democratic developments in mid-19th century France, he embraced them. And he was sort of shocked at the power of the people. And he was so confused by it that he thought it must come from God in some way, that they must be empowered by God to overcome like the oppressive forces against him. And, I'm not going to denigrate believers or unbelievers, but I think you could argue that even if you don't subscribe to a godly theory of change, you can subscribe to what I then refashion as the Lord principle, attributing it to Audre Lorde. And I say it's, could be her principle of we don't know which tools will ultimately usurp the power of the masters, but it won't be their tools. And so I sort of build on her notion to develop this idea that I attribute to her of the Lord principle, but linking it to Tocqueville.
Thanks. Emily, did you want to say something about how education can save us?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great hope. I mean, aside from the kind of obvious point that I think one of the main areas of activism I find the most hope in at the moment is around attempts to change curriculums. So kind of rethinking economics being an obvious organization that's doing important work. And when I think back to what I learned in politics, A-level is like an absolute joke. So there's clearly like very important work to be done that probably more of us need to be doing and digging into. But stepping aside from that, I think some of the most powerful moments I've observed or been aware of in relation to kind of waking people up to the uses of ignorance, the strategic uses of it, or just the kind of lies generally, we could say, that are perpetuated, is in more practical educational applications, which can actually occur in many spaces. It's not like a school or university environment necessarily. Many years ago, I was involved in a project in Tower Hamlets with they were like 12, 13-year-olds. And we were kind of getting them to like design society as they would like it to be. And it was this amazing moment where a couple of them were having a conversation about like, well, we need laws against murder and we need laws against burglary and we need laws against da, 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 da. And one of the others was like, but we wouldn't do that even if there weren't any laws, would we? Would you do that? And they were like, no. And they were like, hang on. And it was this like anarchist awakening moment, which was kind of incredible to witness, but it was because they were being asked to think about the arrangements of the world and how and why people actually behave the way that they do. And it was a very beautiful project. And similarly, I've recently been reading about a US professor who's had her students actually create a mutual aid network and then experience that and the trials and tribulations and watch that unfold, and the way that that has seeded different ways of doing stuff in people's imagination. And I think on a kind of individual level, a lot of people I'm sure who are joining this are involved in various activist things, of course, or local political parties or whatever. And I think we're actually quite shit at inviting that kind of thing into that space, that practical education, like what can we build? We sit around in meetings and then we door knock or whatever. And I think there's a real role to play in giving people the inspiration and the experience of building things differently, and of therefore starting to question what we're told and the power structures that are around us.
Thank you. Lowkey, did you want to say anything on education?
Yeah, I was going to say that we have to understand that the parameters of imagination politically for young people are being more and more restricted. You know, it's not only just the Tories since 2010 cutting over 52% from education, over 400 youth clubs shut, 4,500 youth workers out of their job. It's also the way in which political debate is carefully surveilled and demarcated in careful lines. So we saw not long after the Black Lives Matter movement kicking off in this country, again, you saw the Prevent document leaked that had identified Extinction Rebellion as one of the groups, alongside anti-racist groups, alongside anti-war groups, that could be included as extremists, that if you were to see them having the insignia of these kind of organizations, if they were to organize school strikes, let's not forget that in this country, children only defeated corporal punishment by going on strike from school. Now, that's something that I think, imagine if these stories that we're talking about, the ways in which people won their rights, if people understood, A, where that change came from, that it wasn't bequeathed by the powerful, but two, the agitation which it took to get there, I think that people would feel far more empowered towards a level of political activity. But not only is there, you know, obviously Prevent later retracted. Once that document had been leaked, they said, no, Extinction Rebellion wouldn't be included. I don't know about the rest of the organizations. You're talking anti-racist organizations, other environmental organizations were included there. But what kind of world are people coming out of school to? You know, nearly all of the job growth that we've seen over the past few decades has been from the zero-hour contracts, temporary industry, in comparison to the 1970s, the early 1970s, where the disparity between the richest in the society and the poorest in the society was the smallest it has ever been through British history. What we see now is we are back to, not in terms of quality of life, but in terms of actual disparity and inequality, we are back to pre-World War I levels of disparity, where the top 1% of the society take between 17 and 20% of national income. But how did that happen in the 70s, in the early 70s? How did you get to the point where the top 1% took 6% of national income, 4% after tax? Well, it's because 70% of the population were working in agreements that were protected by agreements that were arrived to through collective bargaining. Well, now we've got only about 26% of the population in such agreement. You've got 1 million people working in zero-hour contracts, around 5 million people in self-employment. So, number one, what kind of world are they coming out of school to? And number two, you know, more people should have considered the connection between the banning of anti-capitalist texts in schools and Black Lives Matter. Because the way the establishment thought about it is, if these young people follow this idea of why Black lives don't matter to its lair, they will find the economic system which carried this place, which is challenged in terms of landmass, limited in terms of natural resource, limited in terms of human resource. How did this place become the world's #1 economy? And what was it that made Black lives not matter? And what was it that made some lives be defined as Black and others defined as white? They would follow it to the economic system. And so therefore they ban anti-capitalist texts. But what is interesting is that the contradictions of capital are continually manifesting in different ways within our society, whether it is leaseholders who bought into Thatcher's idea of a property owning democracy and now literally in a situation where they're going bankrupt, they're having breakdowns because they're trapped in buildings just like Grenfell. You know, the block that caught fire in Canary Wharf fairly recently, you can buy flats in there for £1.3 million. So while unfortunately the impression across British society was to exceptionalize Grenfell rather than generalize it, what you're actually seeing is the contradictions are playing out in many different places, whether it's football fans invading the pitch and saying, how about we completely change the way that the club is owned? Right? What about you look at the way that people reacted to TV channels constantly ramming down our throats footage of Prince Philip? You know, when you look at the figures, people are disillusioned with the system. So the contradictions keep coming out. So even if the education system is doing its best to instill within people a docility and a kind of a way to demobilize them and depoliticize them, the society in and of itself and the contradictions which keep manifesting will continue to politicize people. And as Linsey said, you know, the acts of resistance are plentiful and daily.
Thank you. Yeah, very powerful. And there's a comment here as well, which suggests we also think about social movement learning, popular education, Paulo Freire, change-oriented education, I guess like Saturday schools as well. And yeah, what you were saying about the narrowing of the curriculum really resonated with me as someone who did a lot of national curriculum teaching to my kid during lockdown. Right, okay, we are running out of time, so I am going to read a few questions out to you guys, and then you can take what you want from them. Can you speak to the recent grassroots resistance to the structural strategic ignorance obscuring the coloniality of Palestine's occupation? What more could be done to take that resistance further? So there's a question about Palestine. Can the panel speak about climate justice, about the ongoing colonialization of the majority world, particularly in relation to the unknowing of indigenous knowledge and the fetishization of tech solutions? So does anyone want to have a go at any of that?
I mean, I'd personally really love to hear, you know, Lowkey's thoughts on the Justice for Palestine movements that are growing, because clearly he has done so much work in this area. But I just on that point, I guess I did attend this Left Book Club great event 2 weeks ago with Gargi and others. And I found it fascinating that Gargi said, you don't know the tipping point when a popular consciousness grows and actually becomes the movement, the moment of some sort of consolidation around a huge paradigm shift, the opening of the Overton window, you know, that term for the realm of what is conceived to be possibly true. And it does seem to me, observing it from the outside as someone with only a real lay knowledge, but longstanding support for the cause of the need for justice for Palestine, to free Palestine. I'm curious Lowkey's views around that, but I did remember seeing that talk and thinking that Gargi was really for me, articulating this idea of possible emancipative ignorance, because before you couldn't know just what you couldn't push when it came to the cause of justice for Palestine. And I know this, you mentioned earlier, I edited a handbook called the Handbook of Ignorant Studies. And we invited a chapter on the suppression of the Nakba in popular conscious and sort of trauma studies, because there's been a real academic unwillingness to acknowledge that suppression of that ongoing dispossession and tragedy is something that doesn't get the same scholarly attention when you look at things like commemoration studies in which horrors in the past are commemorated or not. So I think a year or two ago, we still would have published the chapter, come what negative scrutiny we faced. I feel a little bit more confident now that we can publish this chapter and get more support in standing our ground against any accusations that we're somehow unfairly maligning the state of Israel, which never should have been conflated with the idea that any criticism of Israel is somehow anti-Semitic. I'll defer, hand.
Lowkey, do you want to?
Yeah, so I would say that, the Palestinians have been articulating their unfreedom for many decades. It's now the job, when you have a unified Palestinian movement which engages across not only the Green Line, Gaza, the West Bank, but also the diaspora, where there is a clear understanding about ways to apply pressure to particular levers. If you look at within the Green Line, for example, 50% of construction workers within the state of Israel are Palestinians. You look at the about 25% of the doctors within Israel are Palestinians. You look at the several thousand Palestinians within the IDF, many of them who are walking away and putting down their arms and putting down their uniform. You see an unprecedented level of unity. Now, it's our job in different parts of the world to respond to those yearnings for justice. And I think a key way in which we can do things is looking at the unions that have passed motions a decade ago for BDS and now put pressure on them to implement those motions, because you have, for example, Unite, it has members who are currently working in arms factories that are producing components for the F-16, components for the F-35, that are working on drones and different things like that, that are being exported to the state of Israel. And so obviously Britain, having the historical legacy that it has in Palestine through the establishment of the mandate and the implementation of the Balfour Declaration, it established the foundation for the apartheid reality by founding separate institutions for parts of the population. And then the Zionist movement built upon that with the division of labor. Britain in 1936 really established the organizational basis of the IDF when putting down, the longest strike in recorded human history, which was the Palestinian strike of 1936. So, Britain has a real role here. The question is, how can we organize around core aims that relate to the material conditions within Palestine? And there's many things that we can do. As Linsey said, the Overton window has been blown wide open, but there is an organized policy of lawfare to follow suit with what has happened in Germany and France, whereby anti-Zionism is defined as a form of anti-Semitism, and thus putting pro-Palestinian activism into a space of ambiguous legality. And so I think it's important that we also defend on that front, to depict anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism is not only an unpeopling of 12.5 million Palestinians around the world, it also invisibilizes the tradition of anti-Zionism among Jewish people, which includes, even the person credited with coining the phrase Zionism, who later became an anti-Zionist, Nathan Birnbaum. But moreover, what it says is this citizenship, which is only held by 6.7 million Jewish people in the world, out of a population of about 15 million Jewish people in the world, defines what is and what isn't Judaism, and defines what is and what isn't racism towards Semitic people. Obviously, these ideas of sort of racial belonging, if we look at, you know, a Semite can also be considered to be an Arab too. So there's all of these things that we do have to grapple with, but I think the key issue is focusing on where the particular strengths that we have are, building unity, as broad a church as possible within this country, and focusing on the buttons that we can push, and responding to what Palestinians are asking us to do. Palestinian civil society has requested us to support BDS, and I think that that is an important thing for us to encourage institutions that we are a part of, to do. You know, it was found that financial institutions in this country have over £10 billion invested in companies which are complicit with either the illegal colonization of the West Bank, or the military machine of Israel. Our universities have over £450 million invested in the same kind of companies. It's important that we find ways that we can collectivize and apply pressure on those issues.
Thanks very much. And Emily.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll touch on a couple of the other things that were raised. So very briefly, just on climate, I think the way that the climate movement has been for many years, perhaps changing more recently, is something that brings to mind a very useful question of a political theorist called Carol Backey, which is who benefits? So whenever something's being represented as a kind of issue to us, questioning the way it's being represented and who benefits from that, whether that's financial or kind of a maintenance of particular power dynamics, and indeed a maintenance of that, where that Overton window is a maintenance of what counts as common sense, what's allowed at the table. And I think that it's been heartening to see some of that shift in relation to climate justice, but there's a long way to go before that's the case. The main point I wanted to make was about someone asking about tech solutions and how this relates. And I mentioned it a little bit when I was talking earlier, that it's a really interesting topic in terms of exploitation and kind of your tech solutions, Silicon Valley kind of attitude crowding out organized labor and unions and stuff like that, very much in the vein of the Winner Takes All book by Anand Giridharadas that people may be familiar with. But I think one of the things that can get missed is because the obsession with tech as a solution is partly because there's an obsession with tech generally, this idea that we have progressed as a society and innovation is lauded and all of this stuff. But actually, as I write about in the book a little bit, it's a very natural human thing in psychological research for us to have a wish for certainty. So we don't cope that well psychologically with ambiguity. We probably can all think of examples of that from our personal lives, and it's true on a collective political level as well. And we certainly see that in the way that politics is working, and technology comes in to provide a kind of shiny solution to something. It's usually packaged in a way that completely obscures areas that might not be understood very well, areas that can't be solved. It takes us away from the general political economy and into a kind of bite-sized solution that feels really manageable. And in this way, I actually think that technology, as in an app or whatever, isn't itself the problem. The problem is that wish for the certain shiny thing. So in relation to the sex industry, we have this massively, in a massively problematic way with the Nordic model, the attempt to criminalize clients of sex workers, which does nothing for the underlying structural conditions that mean people have limited options and go into sex work. It does nothing to protect and enhance the rights of marginalized people selling sex, but it comes in with its like little neat package of a solution, and in that way is effectively operating in the same way as an app that says it will help you spot the slaves in your supply chain. And I think that this is a really important thing for us to consider, is how these solutions that are coming in are dictating the bounds of what counts as common sense on an issue. Because once we are foregrounding a solution that is very simplistic in that way, immediately off the table are the deeper, more complex, more ambiguous, harder fights that are about the economy, that are about immigration policy, and so on. So you again see this in sex work debates very clearly, where decrim position is saying, actually, we need to address austerity, we need to address asylum seeking systems and the subsistence payments people are on, we need to address student loans. And because there is this shiny thing over here that's actually implementable overnight, those things are considered radical, completely crazy, not common sense. And in that way, we're having our kind of field of political vision curtailed by these very simplistic, technological or not solutions.
Thank you. Well, there's a million different things I want to ask you and other people who do here as well, but sadly we're running out of time. I wanted to ask you the difference between ideology and ignorance, but anyway. So I'll leave the last comment to one of the viewers who says, we only get what we are organised enough to take. And say a massive thank you to everyone here watching and to all our brilliant speakers. I'll just give you a few reminders from the Left Book Club and its Fight Against Ignorance. So you can visit theleftbookclub.com if you want to become a member. You can subscribe to our newsletter, follow the Left Book Club on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and there is a free copy of Rosa Luxemburg's Socialism or Barbarism with every new subscription until the end of this month. The next event is on the 10th of June at 7 o'clock UK time, and it's on anti-capitalism and nature with Noga Levy-Rapport, Keston K. Perry, Nujin Durya and Gargi Bhattacharya. But thank you everyone for a great discussion. Bye now.